I'd like to thank everybody for coming tonight. This is the SD Forum Ruby SIG. This is our second event. The first one was also here. Tonight's speaker, Jack Herrington, is going to tell us about code generation with Ruby. And I need to say a disclaimer that this is going to be on Google Video once we're all done, and that Jack is fine with all that. And so afterwards, if you miss something, you can just hopefully be able to go check it out online. Just by way of brief introduction, I'm one of the SIG co-chairs. My name's Greg. I work here at Google as a product manager, and I think that Ruby has a lot of promise. Google has yet to recognize that promise, I would say, to a large degree. But I think in the long run, Ruby will probably become more and more popular here, and this is part of that trend. So welcome, enjoy dinner, and thank you for coming. Jack?
All right, so my name is Jack Herrington. About 3 years ago, I stand right here, I think. Eric and myself wrote a book called Code Generation in Action, published by Manning, and it was a Ruby book, basically. At the time, I didn't get to say it was a Ruby book because Ruby wasn't as popular as it is now. If it were re-released today, I could go, yes, it's Ruby, yes! And I'm sure people would buy it by the droves. It's still available on Amazon, $29.95, last time I checked. So the way I like to do these things is really informally. You know, if you have any questions or anything like that, just kind of pop up anytime. And we can have a little chat about this sort of stuff. I don't like to do the blah, 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 blah thing. It doesn't really work for me, so. So my initial assertion is a good programmer is a lazy programmer, right? So you don't want to write. What's that? Yes. Not super lazy. You got to get a program out eventually. But yeah, the idea is that you don't want to write thousands of lines of code. For every line of code you write, there's a potential bug. So the less lines of code you write, and the more intelligently you write them, the better off the application is by the end of the day. So I think we've all kind of seen something like this. You know, there's time, and there's what you want to do, and it starts by planning it, and then doing it, and then kind of testing it and whatnot, and deploying it. Right? Pretty simple sort of stuff. And in reality, you get a lot of this sort of decidifying and whatever, and that takes up a lot more time than you figured it would. And then there's always the testing and deploying time, and the QA is like, no, you gotta have a month, and that's it, the hard line. So what gets squished in the middle is coding. And invariably, it just comes down to just type fast. Make it happen fast. So why type stuff? The frameworks that we have are really bad, like J2EE is not a particularly good framework for this sort of stuff. So, and one counterpoint argument to all of this is why even use J2EE? Why use Rails or something like that? But sometimes we don't have a choice. And when I wrote this book, there was no Rails, so there was no kind of counterpoint to say, well, you just don't do J2EE. So what we did in this book is talk about how to use Ruby, a tool we like, to help us generate code that we don't like. Save ourselves from typing. And generally speaking, I find that strongly typed languages like C++, or C# or Java tend to require more code. I mean, is that kind of people's experience? Yeah, okay. So alternative to typing really fast and getting RSI, you can either copy and paste code, which I'm sure everybody loves. You can write macros in a language like C++, or you can use your word processor, or your editor's macros like Emacs or VI. Do a lot of programming that way. You can use wizards, like back in the days of MFC, there was a dialog wizard that would manage stuff for you. And that's what we call passive code generation. I'll get more on that in a second. Or you can use active code generation. So what is code generation? You basically start with some sort of specification. Like as an example, I'll just throw out a schema for a database. And you run it through some sort of black box. Call it the code generator. And you get at the end code. And in passive generation, that's the end of the line. That's the, you use your generator, you got in your code, you start hacking on it with Emacs or VI, or your IDE, and there's no round tripping. In active generation, the code portion here, I've kind of dotted it for effect, is transient. So it's a two-way type thing. You change the spec, you regenerate, that regenerates the code, and you don't edit the code directly, although there are some exceptions to that. What you can do is you can generate code that has safe zones in it, and then have that generator be smart enough to actually go in to the code before it runs the generation cycle, take the existing code, grab out all the segments that you've modified in little zones, and keep those so that the next time when it generates the code, it kind of puts back your refinements. Everybody kind of following along with that? I can kind of go into more detail if you want me to. Sure.
I don't understand the difference between passive and active. I see the same chart there, essentially.
Sure. Yeah, it is kind of subtle. So this two-way thing means that you have an active relationship with the generator. So that code file that you generate at the end is not something that you edit manually. The generator is always in control of it. So a really good way to enforce that, and you really should enforce that, is to actually have it as part of the build process. So those generated files aren't checked into the source code control system. They're built as part of the process. Unless you want to use this safe zone technique, which allows you to edit that file, make minor revisions. And the value of that is, not often can you build a spec that actually has every single edge case in it that you're going to need. So things like special business case logic, stuff like that, that can all be put into safe zones, and you can maintain that from generation cycle to generation cycle. Sure.
How would you classify something like interface builder?
For Mac?
Yeah.
So this is the Cocoa thing, right?
Yeah.
Sorry. Right. Probably active generation. I mean, do you edit the files correctly? Oh yeah, you do. I guess. Yeah, there are. Right, but there are zones where you can wait.
Can you repeat the question?
Interface builder. So tell me a little bit about the output.
Tim can tell you more than I have. I've only used it.
Most of what you get with Interface Builder are objects. They call them freeze-dried objects because they're just like objects
right,
stored in a file. So they don't even want you to really see the code associated with it. But
can you edit that code later on?
I'm sorry?
Can you edit that code later on?
No.
Okay. So it's kind of like a resource file.
There is also a way to declare classes inside Interface Builder and write headers and templates for that stuff.
So you can do it kind of like IDE.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. This is kind of 101-ish stuff. There are a lot of exceptions in edge case, that sort of stuff. Question in the back?
Oh no, I was just saying you actually addressed what I was going to ask.
Oh, okay.
I was just saying that back here we're having trouble hearing, so that if someone asks a question, if you could just repeat it, that would really help.
Oh, I see.
That's all.
Hello. You want me to do this? I go like that. All right.
Stay off camera.
Oh yeah. Okay, so I'll try to be grandiose. So maintenance hell, right? And that's one of the problems that I hear about generators all the time is, it was great that the first programmer wrote this generator and all this sort of stuff, but how does it get maintained on the line? So what I wanted to kind of put out there was, some sort of levels of gradation between sort of heaven and hell when it comes to this sort of stuff. And at the top, as kind of a calibration, I put Rails, which is in heaven, and maintenance heaven. And at the bottom, I put 50,000 lines of hand-coded assembly.
There's no earth, there's no purgatory to heaven.
Oh, okay, I guess there should be. Well, okay. All right, so then kind of a little bit down, not too bad, is when you copy and paste fragments of code around, and then copy and pasting actually whole classes around is significantly worse. The standard template library in C++ is pretty much down there, and then the errors generated by the standard template library is even worse. And kind of in between the two, I see passive generators. So I really don't think you should ever use them. And then the code generators that I'm going to talk about kind of sit somewhere between heaven and hell. And what makes for a hellish code generator? So it's clearly not documented well, not maintained well. I mean, all that sort of stuff. I won't go through all this sort of stuff, but you get this, CG is a design smell, where people are talking about how the framework is bad, the whole idea of the generator is bad. Basically, the idea is, and I'll go on the heaven one, that what you want to do is write something that is generally maintained by the team as a complete package, actively, is active in the build process, is well documented, people know what it is, and uses an existing tool set that everybody agrees on. So, to give a little background on me. So I run a site called, or used to run a site called the Code Generation Network. Anybody ever been there? Codegeneration.net? Hey, great. Okay, good one, hands. That's good. And I ran that for, I guess, 2 and some years. And as part of that, I got to talk to all kinds of people. And they're writing generators and maintaining them and all that sort of stuff. And we have a catalog of 250 different code generators. And the really, really successful ones that I've seen are the ones where they make the best use of the off-the-shelf technologies. So there are some generators out there that nobody uses, in particular because they take like text templating as an example. Text templating, as I'll show, is a big portion of this thing. And they actually go and build their own text templating language. So why would you go and do that? Right? There are, I think, almost 20 different Ruby code or text templating systems out there. So use one of those instead of writing your own. And that's one of the big things that I've seen in successful code generators is to use the stuff that's off the shelf. I think all of these are pretty much self-explanatory. Again, handle discrete tasks is really important. And don't try and build the entire application through the code generation system. Just try and build, the small pieces of it that make sense and can speed you up, as opposed to getting caught up on the edge cases and things like that. I feel like I'm going really fast. Is it people okay so far? Yeah. I mean, this is Google, right? You guys are brainiacs. Okay, so here's the stuff that I see most often as targets of code generation. Generally, right at the top, database code, followed by the CRUD user interface stuff. So this is the back end stuff, like maintaining what you consider like the back end of the database application, adminning the tables, creating or moving constant records, things like that. In case of J2EE, things like configuration deployment files. Help is another thing, like Doxygen, stuff like that, where you go and scanalize code, figure out what's going on and generate HTML from it, a bunch of different things. JavaDoc, stuff like that. Language interface code, tools like, what's that one that you guys use to go between like C and Python or whatever? Swig, right, that's a good example there. And then stuff that's going to take a specification of any kind of format. I've seen it for network formats, I've seen it for file formats, and go and build the reader and the writer of that format in several different languages. So you maintain a file format spec in XML, and you generate a Python reader and a Java reader and a C++ reader and so on and so forth. So let's kind of drill down on one, look at how to generate database stuff. So we start with an XML spec that defines the tables, the fields, the relationships between the tables. We run it through a Ruby generation script, and that builds an SQL file that you then put into your database. Pretty simple. And the advantage of this is that you can go and take that Ruby generator that is maybe going to MySQL and then rejigger it and have it take the same XML spec and make an Oracle script, or both, or whatever. A refinement of that is to use, so this one would have, elements inside of the script that would basically say, print out, create, blah, 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 blah. And this one would use an ERB SQL template using a text templating system. Anybody familiar with ERB? Big part of Rails? Yeah, sort of, hands up, no, kind of, yes, great, okay. Where you go and take an ERB template that's got the SQL code in it and use that to generate the SQL file. And this is a much preferred design because it's kind of like in a web application separating the interface logic from the application logic. Does that kind of make sense? This is kind of like in a generator world, this is like 2-tier design as opposed to that, which is 1-tier design. Yeah? Okay. So then another variant on this is to have 2 different templates and generate 2 different outputs. One would be the SQL file that would preload the database, and the other would be, say, a set of PHP classes that would go in, access the database. The value of that is that you're always going to have the 2 database schemas synced, right? So the stuff that's in the PHP is going to look for the same fields that are set up by the SQL to get to the database. So you're not going to have this kind of impedance mismatch where you're going to be looking for fields that aren't there and blah, blah, blah. Again, you can work this both ways. You can either have those PHP classes set up, no touch, no touchy, whatever, with a little header at the top that says, don't edit this file. Or you can go and use the safe zones, as I showed in the previous example. This thing's still working. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I got a question from bothering me for 5 slides now.
Sure.
When you say code generation, do you mean something that actually produces a file necessarily?
Yes.
Or do you consider like active record, during runtime generates code that only lives for that runtime? Is that also code generation?
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, yeah, so does code generation cover, with my use of the word code generation, cover objects like active record, which dynamically adapt to objects, to tables on the fly? I'm not a language purist. I'm not going to cover it in this talk. I have done a lot of that work with method missing in Ruby, and with there's a PHP 5 now supports that as well, and Python supports it as well. I'm not going to cover it, but what I consider code generation, I don't know. I don't think it's regenerating code. It's just, or does it generate code?
The finders in active record generate SQL statements on the fly to do queries.
Right, you have
based
to.
on the Ruby.
Okay, so I guess there is that.
Yeah, so to kind of follow up with that question, so you have STL as a code generation thing, so that's what you're looking at.
Oh, no, I had SQL as a joke. But I just threw it out as like a calibration of here's heaven, here's hell.
Okay, so that's kind of it.
Yeah, I guess. No. Yeah, there's a couple areas that I don't personally get into. I don't get into templates all that much, or the even weirder stuff, which is to do the Turing complete templates that I've seen some people do. The other thing is, a lot of people got on me when the book first came out that they were looking for like a sequel to the Dragon book, and when I said code generation, they were saying, "Oh crap! I was looking for something that's the back end of a compiler. And your book isn't about the back end of a compiler. I'm about writing application code." So yeah, in both you use the word code generation. Code generation is also, you hear it as metaprogramming as well. I don't know. Anybody hear metaprogramming, that term? Okay. There's a Christoph Zarnecki book, I think, called, is it metaprogramming? Or is it?
Generative.
Generative coding, right. Okay, so yeah, same sort of idea with creating file formats. I mean, this is sort of part and parcel of the same sort of thing. In this case, you're generating Java classes in JUnit stuff, and which are then tested by JUnit, and the same sort of thing with generating both Python and Java. So can people kind of see the value in that, or yeah, makes sense, right? So why Ruby? Because I wrote the book. You should buy the book. It's good. My kid needs shoes. So, no, seriously though. One of the cool things about Ruby at the time when I wrote the book was that Ruby wasn't being used in production, right? So one of the big values of using Ruby was it's not only easy to use, but you're not going to be generating Ruby in Ruby, because you need production code. So you're going to be generating C++ from Ruby or Java. And when you're looking through these templates, it's pretty easy to distinguish what's Java from what's Ruby. When you actually have Ruby generate Ruby or Perl generate Perl, as I had in one job, it gets really confusing. What is this if? Is this if what's supposed to be out, or is this the generated code, or is this the generator code? And it just gets hairy. So that's one thing.
Just out of curiosity, does that mean you would not recommend using Ruby to do any code generation? Would you recommend another one?
As I said, that was when the book first came out. I think so. It should be fine, but I mean, again, you're going to run into that issue just maintaining it. I mean, are there other reasons people can think about using Ruby? Ruby has evolved since when I wrote it, or since when I wrote the book. So, are there other things people can think of? As I say, it's an interactive lecture. Okay, you can do it. So, let's look at some Ruby, finally, after 8 bazillion slides. So, wow, can anybody see that? Or is that just, wow. Right, all right, so there's our input file, very complex. There's a list of tables. There's only one, it's an author, and its name is author, and it has one field called title. That doesn't make any sense. Should be name, whatever. Right? I wrote this in a bleary-eyed state. What do you want from me? So, okay. And then here's our incredible Ruby generator code. You basically go and open up DB for writing, db.sql for writing. Then we use the awesome RexML library to go and parse through schema. We use its XPath stuff to get each one of the tables, suck out its name, get each one of the fields, put them into an array, and then basically do a bunch of prints to go and get the MySQL out the door. Pretty straightforward? Yeah? And then the result is that, which is MySQL for creating a table with an author with a field called title, which now doesn't make any sense. So we'll go on to the next slide and show how to use ERB to do the same sort of thing. So again, same kind of table stuff. In this case, we're going to get the template, create a new ERB instance with that template, and then basically just write out the result of binding the local variables, name and field, to the ERB template, which is shown below. So, everybody pretty clear on that one? Yeah? Alright, and the result is basically the same thing with some character return file formatting differences, which are not really relevant to MySQL. MySQL doesn't care about white space, so you just go for it. Wow, yeah. Man, there's no way anybody could see that. I was expecting like the big Mondo screen, you know? Okay, so what is the state of Ruby code generation today? We'll talk about Rails. So, I can talk a certain degree about Rails, not in deep talk about. Right. So, what is it going to build? It's going to build basically the core elements, the Rails architecture, views, controllers. One of the great things is it's modular, so you can actually go and add in your own templates and processes, and go and build other things using the Rails generation system. It obviously works in conjunction with Active Record. There's a bunch of Ruby text templating tools, ERB being the one that kind of comes with 1.82, I think. Certainly came with my version 1.82. CS template. RSmarty is a Ruby port of the awesome PHP Smarty template library, which is great. Radius ports, and then down at the bottom, I've mentioned XSL because I've done a lot of code generation with XSL, and it actually turns out to be quite nice once you get over the bizarro syntax, and the excellent RexML library. Anybody XSLT veterans out there? Yeah? Once you get into the groove of it, it's not that bad. It isn't. And a friend is.
It's like saying APL or read and write language.
What's that?
APL is not that bad. You can read it and write it.
Yeah, right, yeah, okay.
There's also Builder.
Okay. So what is Builder?
That's the XML template generator.
Oh, cool. Okay.
It's Ruby syntax, so you just put Ruby objects and it's a DSL for constructing XML documents.
Oh, cool.
And that's the RXML template extension.
Oh, neat. Builder.
Yeah, Jim Wyber built it.
Awesome. I'll check it out.
Yeah, it's very slick.
Cool. Thanks. I wish I had a well, I could edit the slide. I'll try and remember it. What are we talking about? Oh, okay. So some code generation projects in Ruby. There's a JavaScript compiler or Ruby to JavaScript interpreter. I guess that's kind of similar to what Google's done with their Java to JavaScript thing. Designed by Contracts for C is really cool. I actually talked to the guy that wrote that. It's preconditions, postconditions for C++ by looking at the comments in a C++ file using Ruby. There's you know, a couple of generic frameworks. Codecopily is one that I'm reasonably familiar with. But wow, we'll whip through this thing. So what's the time? What's that?
The time?
Yeah, time.
7:40.
7:40? So that's what, 30 minutes? Well, we might get out early. I guess that's a good thing.
What's the last item on that slide? The generic code generation?
Argent and Codecopily? So a bit more perspective then. MDA is model-driven architecture. It's an effort by the OMG to kind of put some sort of standards on this thing, even though the standards are a little nebulous. Yeah, I know. There are some large pay-for products out there that do this. Blanking on the name at the moment, but anyway, so that some of the more formal thing, DSL, domain-specific language. As you mentioned, that's basically a way of saying that you're going to go and build a very small language to go and generate as an input to one of these generators that's specific to the domain. Example is MathML, so you're writing equations out and it automatically generates from the equation PDF or whatever you want. CG and code generation and CGN is my X-site code generation network, and some cute little things. Okay, so if you want to look more deeply into this, obviously Code Generation Network, great place to go. My book, Code Generation Action, Pragmatic Programmer, is Dave Thomas's book, and he actually has a small section on using code generation to get better performance out of your coding time as opposed to typing faster. And yeah, generative programming is the Christoph Zarnecki book, which I find my book tends to be a little bit more practical, and the Zarnecki book tends to be a bit more theoretical. And if you want to, if we ran out of time or had extra time, there's certainly a bunch of things that I can talk about if you want to talk about those things. So I guess I'll open up to the floor if you want to talk about stuff. Any questions?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Shoot.
So I've been spending a fair amount of time digging around in Active Record, and being largely disgusted at how it does the SQL generation.
Okay.
And I look at it, and I'm not a real compiler guy, and I'm not real great with the parsing and the code generation. But I look at it, and it seems like there's this crazy mishmash of dealing with things at the SQL statement level, and string pattern, regular expression kind of stuff,
right?
And then dealing with things at the domain object level of active record objects and associations and associated objects, and somehow getting that mishmash to generate the actual SQL that you send to the database.
Right.
And it seems like there could be some kind of intermediate representation, something like an abstract parse tree.
Oh, for SQL?
For SQL,
yeah,
that would make it easier to manipulate all that. Do you have anything in your book that talks about that, or can you speak to that now?
Like a 3-tier code generator, essentially, where the second tier is like an intermediate, like
right.
What do they call it, P-code state or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. It's been a while since I did the Dragon book.
Yeah, I'd have to look.
I did that about a dozen years ago.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Do tell.
So I'm rusty on it, but the gist
was that what you really wanted to do was to take your specification and turn it into not a parsed tree, but a directory sequential graph. And you have several different types of nodes. There would be nodes that essentially represented a final result that essentially the select. What are the items that you're selecting at the end? Because you don't always want to do select star. Often you don't. So there's that's kind of the root. Let's see. No, those are the leaves. And a few layers up from that, you have some, and then you add some other nodes that represent things that are essentially conditions. And you can have group bys and things like that represented by intermediate nodes of flow train. And you've got a number of different node types. I forget how I set it all up. It's once you've worked through all the different types of things you might want to do with group by and having and where and certain kinds of subqueries, you can actually represent it with, I think, somewhere between a half dozen and a dozen different classes of nodes. And you'll build this graph, which is essentially a dependency graph that shows what things depend on what. So, this where clause depends on the following things. This one of those things depends on, it depends on some other things that we actually have to do a subquery to do. So the entire where clause depends on that subquery. And from that, you can actually do reasonable manipulations because your data structure really represents the truth about what you're trying to manipulate. So you can define pretty rigidly a set of valid manipulations against that data structure.
I get the feeling to do that,
and then you traverse it, and then once you've manipulated all you want, you can actually optimize by detaching and reattaching subtrees. And then you just traverse it, and your sequence goes down.
I think the problem with doing that in Active Record right now is that you can specify SQL as some of the options.
That's it.
So you would need to parse that out.
Yeah, and that would
be messy.
That's very.
Yeah.
So
SQL is not
really good book.
There are ways to do it, and it's not that hard.
Yeah, I actually think there's one particular example in here of generating big decimal equations in Java. So doing all the work to actually generate the code for taking a particular equation and turning it into a bunch of big decimal calls. And that has to do both the work of tokenizing and interpreting the equation into something in memory and then rendering it into Java. And that's essentially like a three-phase thing. So you can kind of use that as essentially a template for what you're talking about. Basically to take, I guess, you have at the top end what? Like when you're, okay, you have a bunch of objects and you want to, all right.
Yeah, and a finder in Active Record has options, things like what's the select clause, what's the joins, what's the conditions and the order and the grouping, and you can basically take an SQL statement and break it into these small chunks.
Right.
But then many of those chunks are it's a string that's an SQL code fragment.
Right.
And so you have to be dealing with things at both the level of domain objects and at the level of SQL code fragments at the same time. And then you try and get into the code generation and see how am I going to create this expression that does a more sophisticated kind of join. Like someone was saying, oh, I want to do, has one through instead of has many through. And it's just,
a mess.
Yeah,
right. Okay.
It's a pain to do. So, and while it's really easy to conceive of how to create that association in terms of the domain objects, it's really hard to get from that to the SQL code to do the join.
Bunch of questions up the back. Guy way in the back.
One of the things that I found with Rails is that, especially with Active Record, is that the Active Record is designed for least common denominator, and there's no no optimization for the various databases that are out there. And if you're trying to move something into a production area, that could be a bit of a problem. Not too long ago, I think about a month and a half ago, I can't remember who it was, but there was a gentleman who, in an attempt to teach people how to better optimize their code, he came up with a library specifically for MySQL as an example on how to do this for whatever your database is, and that it took advantage of a lot of the optimization features for that particular database engine. And this is one of the beauties of Ruby, is that you can easily extend or replace current functionality by redeclaring the class. And as you're redeclaring the class, you can either add methods or you can replace existing methods. And so if whatever database you're working with, if you find that you have a better way to do it, the first thing to do is write the code to do it. And once you can prove to yourself that you can do it, then you can package that into a plugin and make it available to the community, unless you don't, unless it's something just for your company. And then at that point, it can start to mature itself. And once it gets widespread acceptance, then that's better for the community, and it helps other people learn how to do what it is that you're attempting to do, or at least identify the problem that you've identified.
Can you give me a size estimate on reworking that from MySQL to SQL Server? Man months or staff months?
I can't. I mean, it depends It depends on what it is that you're trying to do.
Is it 12 or 24 or 100 or 1,000?
It depends. Well, it depends on what exactly you're trying to do. There was somebody who, in a few hours. Yeah, a few hours. I believe it was a few hours. Dave Thomas, in his blog, gives a reference to somebody else who basically extended Active Record specifically for SQL Server, and to take advantage of some of the features that were there.
Well, my understanding is what you're talking about is that you're not actually completely overriding everything. You're basically saying, in this case, I'm going to go out and do it. So it's a question of how much do you want to optimize specifically for SQL Server.
Exactly.
Or tax.
No, I get it.
Conceivably,
but, you don't have to necessarily
yeah.
override everything. You may just find that there's one particular query that you're having issue with, and then figure out a way to kind of say, okay, well that's the case, blah blah blah, and I want to override at that point.
Well, the beauty is that you can do it. You can either do pieces or you can do the whole thing. It's entirely up to you and what it is that your needs are.
So for the kind of code generation you're talking about, I think probably most people's kind of first encounter with Rails is scaffolding.
Right.
And that's like a very straightforward application of the kind of code generation.
Yeah.
But it's very one way, right? Because it takes
passive.
It's very passive. Could that be made smarter? Like, realistically, is there a way that you could make it so that the code generation tries to keep itself in sync, even as you start to evolve those scaffolding files that the generator creates?
Yeah, that's what the save zones I was talking about earlier. You can actually put in, there's a section on it. Special comments that basically say, here's an area where you should override to do particular things, and then the generator can actually go in before it zaps the file with a new version, suck out the old code, and then put that into the safe zones where it would appear in the new code, and so thus preserving your changes in well-specified areas. With Ruby, it's somewhat, that's a technique for statically typed languages. With Ruby, the nice thing is, again, you can use this ability to basically say, okay, you generated blah, right? Now another file is going to come along and redefine that class and add some methods and do that sort of thing, and you don't have to have it all in one file. So it may not you could actually do that in Ruby right now. You can actually just let the generator handle that file, but then extend that file by making another file that essentially redefines the class again, and that's stuff reopens it.
I just wanted to add to that. The general notion first of profiling to find out where your performance hit is really important. And then secondly, using the technique you mentioned, you alias the old method, write a new one, and then you look for that specific thing, handle it, and anything else just pass on, the original method pass on. That's just the beautiful feature of the language.
Yeah, I mean C# and Java are coming up. Like C# 2.0 has the partial classes, so you can have as many implementation. You can have as many files as you want, implement a particular class. So you can have one file that's generated and another file that's custom.
If you combine a couple of techniques, the Rails recipes talks about a definition on how to build your own code generators, specifically within Rails. And then in the Agile Web Development book, he talks about in the controller putting in scaffolding as an actual, it's automatically generated scaffolding on, on the fly when you're first getting into it. One of the things that you could conceivably do is if you have a lot of stuff that is pretty boilerplate and will stay boilerplate throughout the whole thing, but you might make tweaks to the boilerplate here and there. Create your own code generator, stick it in the controller, so anytime that controller gets access, whatever your generator library is set up to do, it will automatically create that on the fly.
Very cool. Love it. More questions or answers? This is great. Sure.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I've already.
Yeah, you expressed a lot of your source examples in XML, like translating XML into SQL. Is that usual tool of choice for expressing what you want generated? Is that typical?
Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, is XML the language du jour of the specification of something? Yeah, I see that a lot. There's a couple of different sources. Again, with the code generation network, I've seen a lot of different generators. A lot of them work from code, so you'll have comments in the code itself. So the generator will read the code, parse out the comments, and then figure out what it needs to generate from that. But when you're just coming from a source, yeah, it's really nice to have an XML file because it can be easily validated. You can have an external validation script.
Before I got into Ruby, I did a lot of code generation from XML and XSLT, and I was just wondering, is there something in particular about Ruby, since you've used both, that you think is much better, given the same problem?
Yeah, well, I guess they're both good. I do think sometimes the XML, the XSLT is like a brain teaser, as opposed to actually kind of getting the job done. It's a little bit more straightforward to read an imperative language as opposed to try and work through the, what was the language you were just trying to learn?
Haskell?
Haskell, right. I mean, it is, sometimes it's a brain teaser to figure out how to do the XSLT. I like both. It's tough to say. They each have the pluses and minuses. Sorry, go on.
In response to that, what I find with XSLT is it's really great up to a certain level of complexity. Because you've got these tools that will just take the one file, take the other file, and turn one into the other on the fly. Maybe on the client side, you don't have to send any code over, it's all right there, and that's great. And then you get to a certain level of complexity and you realize, oh my gosh, this is so hard to debug. Where in my transformation did this thing go wrong? That's the point where I start going, I need to break this down into chunks that I can call procedurally, because having this templating language that's super, super powerful is only good until I really have to debug something deeply hard.
And actually,
also, there are some things that it doesn't really like to do, where they have, as you probably know, there are variables, but they can't vary. I find that a problem at times.
Well, that's when it becomes like a brain teaser, essentially.
That's the brain teaser.
How do I get this to recurse so the right value shows at the right time? Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned an intermediary form where you get where you get in XSLT is you get your initial table of tables or whatever, and then from there, given the complexity of the generator, you have to have another intermediary form, which is the tokens for Java, and another intermediary form, which is the tokens for, there's another XML blob, another set of templates, and these sort of things. So you end up with these
stages before where I go through different stages.
Exactly. So it can get pretty hairy, and it is difficult to debug. Sorry.
Well, one of the things back to the intermediate form was, like the guy in the back was talking about, how do you optimize for the different databases? Rails has these connection adapters to map to the particular databases, but because by the time you get to them, you've lost all of the information about the domain objects in Rails, you can't actually do much rearranging.
Right.
So, there's this, people are trying to do binding in, bind variables in Oracle.
Right.
And it's a pain because you've lost a lot of the information about the domain objects. And if you have this intermediate form to work with that you could then hand to the connection adapters and have them do the generation particular to each kind of database that you're talking to, that seems like that's a reasonable technique to.
Sounds like a good project.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of it is reinventing the compiler wheel.
Yeah. Well. Oh yeah, definitely. Certainly. Right. With generating SQL like that, it is regenerating. You're just doing compiler. You're doing compiler from meta format. Let's go.
So back to this gentleman's question. So another place where Rails does code generation in migration traffic, and the input file to migrations is in Ruby. So Ruby has very pretty syntax of those blocks, and that's how they do the tables. You can create very concise DSL for your input files very easily. That's probably another advantage.
Okay. No question, just an answer, I guess. Eric? Okay. Anybody else? Wow, this is a great turnout. Really. It's good to see all this interest in Ruby and Rails. More Rails than Ruby. Just for my own thing, how many people are here for Rails and how many people are just Ruby enthusiasts in general? So Rails. Ruby? Interesting. Okay. Exclusive. All right.
How are you controlling your MacBook with your phone?
I get that every time I do it.
Selling clicker?
Yes, it is selling clicker, and it's badass. Okay, so here we go. Ready? So
you're not on the wall anymore.
oh, right. So I used to have this. It's still not on? Oh, there it is. It's warming. This is neat. Red projector warming. Still wait. So I used to have this on one of my little Nokia type things, and now it's on a right. I wish I could show this, but let's see. So
We'll show it to the camera so we can see it on the video later.
oh, there you go.
I'm zoomed in already.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you get that?
Uh-huh.
Right. That's showing what's playing on my iTunes. Not that you can hear it. That's weird. Oh, and then so you get a little. If you see it, you can actually see like a little. Oh, it's paused. I get it. So it shows you the album art and the everything you'd expect from iTunes, and then you want to stylus and hit play.
There's really no recognition that what they've been doing.
Yeah. So, and it gives you a little bar that tells you how far along it is, and that's just the iTunes. It's all Apple script, so you can control Keynote, iPhoto. You can actually use here. You can actually use. All right. On my old phone, I could actually do I could control the mouse with my phone and click on it and stuff like that. So pretty neat, actually.
That's not a live radio feed, is it?
No, this is a podcast of NPR's On Point.
Okay.
About the book Fiasco. Good book, by the way. Yeah, it is good. Anyway, so yeah, and there's a whole bunch of there's a community of downloadable scripts to go and basically control everything. This is on Windows now too.
What's the name of the app?
Selling Clicker, SALLING Clicker. It's on Mac. And it used to be on Mac only. Now it's on Windows. And I think on Windows it uses JavaScript and VB script, so you can basically launch anything from your phone.
And it works with phones too, not just Trio.
Right. Regular phones. Yeah. It's got a huge bunch of. The nice thing about this is, with a better device, not like a phone, you actually get when Keynote comes up, it'll give you your slide notes and things like that. Not that I did a lot of slide notes and stuff, but yeah. So,
That's cool.
yeah, it is badass. And then of course, you always get like, how do you do that?
Yeah.
And then whatever, if your presentation sucks, you still got this, right? Yeah.
Which certainly wasn't the case, right? Thank you. Thank you, Jack.